Hello students, welcome back to another episode of Principles of Micro. Today we are in Chapter 6 looking at price controls. So price controls can come in one of two forms. There are price ceilings, that's where the government sets a maximum price. There are also price floors, that's a minimum price. So some students get confused about which one's the maximum and which one is the minimum. Here is a simple mnemonic to help you keep them straight. You can't go above a ceiling and you can't go below a floor. That means that the price ceiling is saying the price can't go above this limit. Because you can't go below a floor, that means the price can't go below the price floor. The price floor is a minimum price. We distinguish between price controls that are binding and non-binding. We're going to start by looking at price ceilings, and we'll start by looking at non-binding price ceilings. A price ceiling as non-binding is easier to analyze, so that's why it's first on our list. Price floors are largely the same thing in reverse. So once you have a good grasp of price ceilings, the section on price floors shouldn't be that hard. So we say that price ceiling is non-binding if the market price remains legal. So here's an example. So the market price, we know, is always set by where does supply meet demand. We learned that back in Chapter 3. So here's supply and there's demand. They meet over here at a price of 7. Now let's suppose the government sets a price ceiling at $8. We just said the price ceiling is a maximum price, so the government's telling people you can't charge a price higher than $8. Prices have to be below $8. Well, the market price of 7 is already below $8, so nothing would happen at all. The market would continue trading at a price of $7, and this price ceiling would have no impact. So, like I said, a non-binding price ceiling is pretty easy to analyze. It does absolutely nothing to the market outcome. So, a binding price ceiling is one that makes the market price illegal. Let's continue with that previous example. So we had supply and demand at a market price of 7. Now let's say instead the government sets a price ceiling at $5. That means the price cannot go above 5. The market price of 7 would be against that law, so we can't keep trading at a price of 7. Now the outcome is going to have to change. Now we learned back in Chapter 3 that if you charge any price other than the market price, you get either a surplus or a shortage. So what kind of issue is created by a binding price ceiling? Will this lead to a surplus or will it lead to a shortage? Go ahead and pause the video here and think about that. When you think you have your answer, press play. Alright, I'll assume you've given that some thought. So if our price ceiling is at $5, that means that our quantity supplied is going to be over here. Quantity demanded is going to be way out here. So there's more demand than there is supply. So all the supply is going to be bought up, and you'll still have more people trying to buy even more. You're going to run out of goods because not enough is being produced. So if you run out of goods, that's called a shortage. So in general, binding price ceilings create shortages. So one example out of many, in some parts of the world, there are binding price ceilings on the price of medical drugs. And sometimes the drug companies respond to that by refusing to sell in those countries. So they create shortages with these binding price ceilings. So what does a binding price ceiling do to social welfare? We compare it to the market outcome. So here's a market with no price controls. You have demand, you have supply, and a market price. Consumer surplus is this upper triangle over here. So recall, consumer surplus is the gap between what you're willing to pay, that is demand, and the price you actually pay, the market price P star. So this represents how much better off consumers are from these transactions. Producer surplus, PS, is this lower triangle over here. That's the gap between the price the producer be willing to accept, that's on their supply curve, and the price they actually get in the marketplace. So if you're willing to sell for a price as low as $3, but the market price is $7, you're getting a $4 surplus. 7 minus 3 is 4. So we said earlier the market outcome maximizes consumer and producer surplus, so we call it sum total surplus. If you impose a binding price ceiling, then you're going to lose total surplus. So we have this red triangle here, which is deadweight loss. So this area, which was over here on the other graph, used to be partly consumer surplus and partly producer surplus. Now, however, it's nobody's surplus. That's because when you force the price to go below the market price, then producers cut back on supply. They only produce Q prime instead of Q star. Therefore, these mutually beneficial trades that would help out both sides end up not taking place. So for these transactions, consumers are willing to pay this much up here. Sellers would accept the price down there. So both sides would benefit from these trades, but these trades don't happen anymore due to the price controls. So total surplus goes down. So there's some deadweight loss and some inefficiency from the binding price ceiling. Producer surplus is going to shrink. That's because you've lowered the height of this triangle. So back here, we see the triangle's height goes up to the market price, P star. That would be up here. So instead of going from here to here, now we're just going from here to there. So we've lowered the height of the producer surplus triangle. We've also reduced the base. Instead of going all the way out to Q star, we're now just going out to Q prime. So if you reduce both the base and the height, that triangle is going to shrink. So producer surplus goes down. That should not be a big surprise. If you force producers to charge a lower price, that makes them worse off. Producers like higher prices. The effect on consumer surplus is going to be ambiguous. On one hand, the height is going to increase. Instead of going down to the market price over here, we're now going all the way down to this lower price of 5. Consumers like getting lower prices. On the other hand, though, the base has shrunk. We don't buy Q star units anymore. We don't only buy Q prime because only Q prime are available. So while consumers like getting lower prices, they don't like having fewer goods available to them. So it's not clear if consumer surplus will expand or shrink. Now, one popular justification for binding price ceilings is in the aftermath of a disaster. So there's like a hurricane, or I guess we have wildfires now on the West Coast. Those often are used as a justification for imposing a temporary binding price ceiling. They're designed to combat what's referred to as price gouging. And price gouging means companies exploiting people's increased willingness to pay for necessities. So, one possible illustration. Let's look at the market for generators after a power outage. So we can't get electricity from just turning on the lights. If there's a power outage, you gotta have some other source. So you have to suddenly want to buy a generator to use that instead to keep the lights on, keep the fridge on, keep the power running. So people are suddenly much more willing to pay for generators after a hurricane or something like that. So old demand might be back here at D0, leading to a market price of over there. After the disaster, willingness to pay is going to soar, and now we're at D1, this much higher demand because people suddenly want generators when there's no power. Now, if there were no price controls, that surge in demand would create a big increase in prices. Prices would jump from 4 all the way up to 7. Well, of course, a generator in real life costs more than $4 or even more than $7. Let's say prices are in hundreds. So this is 400 and that's 700. So a natural disaster could cause a huge increase in price for necessities like generators. And people would be very upset if they're being exploited and having to pay way more money for a generator. They refer to that as price gouging, and the government takes action to try to limit that. Now, importantly though, natural disasters are not an exception to the laws of economics. Binding price ceilings create deadweight loss and create inefficiency in normal times. In disasters, binding price ceilings still create inefficiency and still create deadweight loss. And they still create shortages too. So we said back over here that we create a shortage because now suppliers only want to produce QS instead of Q star. That's still true even during a disaster. So during a disaster, unsurprisingly, stores end up running out of batteries, they run out of generators, and now there's just not enough of them to meet people's needs. So the binding price ceiling designed to address price gouging ends up creating shortages which are new and bigger problems of their own. If you allowed the price to soar, you'd have some very expensive goods in the short run, but at least you would not have inefficiency or any loss of total surplus. Remember, a binding price ceiling ends up banning trades that benefit both the consumer and the producer. You're banning things that everyone benefits from. Not a good idea. So it has this emotionally charged term, price gouging, which sounds really scary and very upsetting, but in reality, it's just a justification for a bad idea. Economists are overwhelmingly opposed to binding price ceilings and anti-price gouging laws. You still reduce social welfare. So as a result, this makes these natural disasters even worse. So if the price were allowed to go to the market price, that would provide a bigger incentive to producers to supply more generators and pay the extra cost to get them to the marketplace. Remember, in the aftermath of a disaster, shipping goods is not quite so easy as it was before. So after a hurricane, you might have these fallen trees blocking highways and causing traffic jams. People try to drive around the fallen trees and stuff like that. So getting goods to market is not so easy. It's going to be very expensive for the producers to do that. They're going to need a higher price in order to make it worthwhile to transport the goods to the disaster zone. So a higher price would allow producers to do that, be able to afford bringing the goods to market, and that would help them meet people's needs. The binding price ceiling, though, makes that unprofitable, so suppliers don't do it, and you get these big shortages. Now, in some ways, the effects of a price ceiling could be even worse than these horrible things that I've listed already. Your book goes through a number of examples. One thing producers can do in response to a binding price ceiling is reduce quality. So some cities like New York City have rent control, which is a binding price ceiling on the rent. Now, price ceilings we showed that are binding lead to shortages. You have more people trying to get into the apartments than there are apartments available. As a result, the landlord can make the apartments less appealing by neglecting maintenance. If they make the apartments less appealing, some people will be discouraged and not want to live there anymore. But there's so many people trying to get in that they can still fill every apartment. They couldn't get away with that in a regular marketplace. In a regular market, supply meets demand, so if you start cutting back on maintenance, you're going to lose customers, and that's going to leave you with empty apartments, and you don't make any money off empty apartments. If you have a binding price ceiling in the form of rent control, creating this artificial shortage, then you can get away with it because you'll still have plenty of people trying to apply, even if conditions are pretty bad. Another drawback to binding price ceilings is that it can lead to people waiting in line. The big example of that is back in the 1970s, the government imposed a binding price ceiling on the price of gas. So just for some historical context, there was an oil embargo in the 1970s where a lot of Middle Eastern countries refused to sell to the U.S. So there's suddenly a lot less supply. Supply is suddenly shifting back for U.S. consumers. Then price will soar. Politicians saw that, and they sought to regulate price with binding price ceilings. So exactly as economists would have predicted, there was a shortage. Again, binding price ceilings do create shortages. As a result, a lot of people had to wait in long lines to get gas. So if you're waiting in line, that's a price that you're paying. Your time is valuable, so that's a cost that you bear. However, there's no corresponding benefit to anybody else. By contrast, if there's a high price, that's a burden on the consumer, but at least someone, the producer, benefits from the high price. If you're just waiting in line, though, that's a price the consumer bears that no one gains from. So back in the 70s, some college students would get extra money by waiting on somebody else's behalf. So you might say, I'll wait in line for you for gas at the gas station on Thursday, and then I pay you some money to do that. And I'll pay you $5 to go fill up their car with gas and wait for them. Another possible issue with a binding price ceiling is that the people who receive the good are not necessarily the ones who value it the most. So you have this many people, QD, who want the good. You only have QS, this amount available. So QS, I found that by looking at where is that price ceiling meet supply. That's how many goods are available. I found how many people want the goods by looking at where is demand meet that price ceiling. So you have more people who want the good than there is available. So if you're trying to minimize the harm, the folks up here with the highest willingness to pay, the highest value they place on the good, they should be the ones who get it, and the folks over here who don't care about the good very much should be the ones who are sent away empty-handed. However, depending upon how the good is rationed, that might not necessarily be true. Maybe some of the folks who don't care about the good very much might get it anyways, and those who care about the good a lot might be left with nothing. So that could be some additional inefficiency on top of the problems we've talked about earlier. So those are some very serious drawbacks to binding price ceilings. Now, there can be some ways to possibly get around these restrictions and reduce or possibly even eliminate the harm of price ceilings. So let's talk about that. So one way to get around a price ceiling would be to simply change the units. Your book gave a simple example of that. Let's say a government decides to regulate the price of bread. They might say, you can't charge more than $2 for a loaf of bread. Well, that price control would probably end up doing absolutely nothing. That's because suppliers could get around it by just making smaller loaves. So if they're trying to sell a $3 loaf, but there's a price ceiling at $2, they just gotta cut those loaves in half and sell each half for $1.50 each. Problem solved. So if you can change the units, then a price ceiling might not do any damage. Another way to get around price ceilings would be to establish a black market. So back in the 1970s, we talked about there were binding price ceilings in the market for gas. So that created predictable shortages. Now, to get around that, what some people did is they tried selling gas illegally at a price that was the market price. So if everyone just goes to these black market sellers and buys at the market price, then you're back to just a regular market outcome and no harm done. I read an article about someone who is selling generators after a hurricane. So what he did is he just bought a bunch of generators in his home state and he wouldn't travel down to the disaster area, and he tried selling them at a price that was above the government price. So that's a black market for generators, and that's a way to get around the price control. However, he was caught and he got some really big fine for helping people. So if you're allowed to charge a price that's much higher than the regulated price, if you're allowed to charge a market price, that could give an incentive for people to go out of state and bring help and supplies to people who are in need. If you're forced to charge a lower price, though, then I'm not going to drive halfway across the country to bring supplies to someone in Texas who needs it after a storm. It's just not worth my time and money. If I could charge a high price, though, then I could break even on my costs of driving down there and staying in hotels and all that, and then I could make things better. So, as you can tell, I and the vast majority of other economists are not a big fan of price ceilings. At best, they're non-binding and do nothing. At worst, they're binding and can do a lot of harm. There are some very limited exceptions. We'll talk about them later on. Some very limited exceptions where price ceilings can do some good. Stay tuned for a future chapter and we will talk about that.